Everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we're back out on the Porsche 924. Today's job is about the front end of the car. We're going to be replacing front discs, front pads, and also the wheel bearings. The reason being is that the front discs, which are the 4-stud design, iconic from the 80s might I add, you will see that the hub itself carries the wheel bearings, so front bearing, rear bearing, situated within the disc itself. So it makes sense that when you change the discs that you also change the wheel bearings. It's very inexpensive and probably the best way to go. Equally, you get neat little kits, like I said, that are very cheap, that come with all the bits, front and rear bearing parts and seals, with additional grease if required. And I've opted for TRW disc pads, substantially thick as you can see, but they seem to do a pretty good job. I've run them before, so we're going to be running with those. That is the job today, so we'll get out there and we'll start walking through the steps. Okay everyone, so I'm going to be doing a bit of voiceover throughout this video just to help anyone who might be going through this job. A couple of hints and tips in the right places. So you've seen me jack the car up. We're on the right hand side of the car, driver's side here in the UK, and we are just about to start removing the hardware now for the caliper. So you can see there's a couple of pins that you've got to just push through to give you access to those springs that help put pressure on the pads for the caliper and pad setup. There they are and removed. Pretty simple, just need a metal punch, which I'm using there. Equally, just a small headed screwdriver will do the job as well. And as I won't be using these pads again, you can be a little bit more forceful just in terms of pulling them out. They should come out pretty easy. There we go. There's a lot of meat left on those ones, but as I've had pretty warped discs for quite some time, and you'll see the condition of the discs in a minute once we get the caliper off, it makes sense to change the pads with the discs at the same time. They're relatively inexpensive, so just a simple thing to do at the right time. Now you should be able to move the caliper freely. There we go. Moves within the cradle. And as you can see, the rubber boots and piston on my calipers are fairly new. They're brand new calipers that I fitted a few years back, so all good there. But it's a good time to check your calipers as you go through this job, just to make sure there's no leaks or anything sticking. We're just going to remove the 2 holding bolts now for the caliper at the back. And at this point as well, because we won't be doing any work on the caliper itself, just having a bungee cord or a good bit of rope to tie around your strut spring to the caliper itself, just to hold it in place so you don't put any pressure on the brake pipe there that you see on the left hand side coming out from the caliper. You basically want to just have it there hanging out the way so it doesn't get in the way of the rest of the work you're doing. Okay, so that final bolt is now out, and of course you can add new hardware if you want to as you're doing this job, and that gives us the release of the caliper now. You can see the 2 holes that the bolt went through there just as I hang it from the bungee cord. And we're now presented with the disc. Not that you will hear this on the video itself, but there's a slight grumble as you turn the disc, which would suggest that the bearings have seen a better day. Removing the dust cover now, get access to the holding nut for the disc and bearing assembly. As you see, there's lots of grease there, very present, so as we go through this job and cover the various steps you'll need to take, grease is your friend on this job, certainly when it comes to bearings and wheels spinning at high RPM. So we just clean that up and get access. A little bit of noise in the background there. So you have to remove, it's an Allen head bolt here. We're just going to remove that, or loosen it off. You don't actually have to remove it completely out of the nut itself. It's like a clamping nut, as you can see there. And then we just loosen it off with a good size spanner. With that off now, there's a gentle pull towards you, and that's the whole unit coming off the spindle in one go. And the thrust washer, which we'll see a little bit later as well, has come off with the bearings and the unit all together. At this point, it's good to give the spindle a wipe down, a clean, just to make sure that it is in good condition and that there's no sort of obvious marks or pitting or grinding. And also it gives us a chance now to get on with a bit of cleaning and get those backing plates looking a bit better than they are right now. And this is a good time to just get rid of some of that loose rust that would have been built up over time. Using brake cleaner now just to get rid of all of the dirt and grime that has come over the years onto this backing plate. As you can see, it dries pretty quickly, so it's a good thing to use, certainly when you're tugging around the brakes. And there we go, all nice and dry. And good time to apply some heavy duty paint. This paint is high heat resistant enamel paint, which I do both sides just to give the backing plate a few years of extra life. Okay everyone, we're at the business end of this job. This is the messy part of the job and probably the most, I guess, difficult part, the seating of the wheel bearings and the races within the wheel bearings. We're going to start with the rear part of the disc, and so we'll break open the seal and the bag, and you'll see it comes in sort of three parts, although these two parts here are quite well attached together. They do move, but that's the inner race to the bearings, and you can see the sort of the cylindrical needle bearing type style that then rolls on the inner, and then when it's inside there it runs on the outer, and then obviously the spindle of the hub goes through the center. So the idea now is it sits like so, and we have to ensure that this seats right down against this lip. It's you might be able to see it there. There's a lip that's cut out, and we've got to force this race right down through the center. Now ideally you can press these in if you have a pressing tool. If you don't have a pressing tool like myself, then a good sized socket, which is the same size as the race there, will do the job as well. So just these are lubricated, but it's good just to use some of that lubrication around the edges just to help with the seating of the race itself. I might use just a little touch more. I mean, it's the lightest of touches, you don't really need too much, but it's just enough to help with things moving forward. I'm just going to make sure that the race, that there's sort of a curve to it that curves out towards you. That's the way you need it to sit within the hub, and then obviously the bearings sit within that. Don't install it the wrong way round, like so, because you'll have problems, and no doubt we'll need to get new bearings and stuff. So we'll put that one in, and we'll line this up, and we'll just start slowly tapping. It's just started to go through. And what I might do is use this one. It gets a better hit. I'm just starting to see it line in now, so I'll just do this. Just want to bring that level. There we go, it's started to go down nicely now. And we're nearly, well, we're past halfway now, because there's a tiny lip on the first one that it just needs to go over. Once you're past that, we are on the home straight. So we'll just hammer this one home now. And there you go. You'll hear a difference in tone to when you are hitting hammer, and that is seated lovely against the bottom lip. There's a slightly different tone that you'll hear when the race is seated nicely, and there should be a nice gradual smooth transition from the race to the inner hub as well. Right, so that's the rear part done, and then your bearings neatly sit there. And what we have to do now is the really messy part, and that is packing these with bearing grease, making sure, like I say, they are lubricated, but they need a lot more lubrication than what's currently there. So let's get that prepared. Okay, so just before we start packing the bearings, I just wanted to get in nice and close for you here. And that's the race that I've just seated within the hub itself, the hub assembly. And you'll see, if that will zoom in, there's a lip that it's resting against there. There's a gap here where it's a gap actually within the hub, but it's sitting nice and flush with the inner part of the hub within the disc. So that's how it should seat if you are doing this job, and that should be all the way around flat against that that lip, and that means that when the bearing fits in there, everything is square and runs very smoothly. Okay, so let's get on and do the messy part now and pack these bearings. Okay, so we have the bearings here, and I'm using standard bearing grease. It does come with a packet, and it gives you an idea of sort of the amount. It's a pretty substantial amount that you have to sort of bury in here to make sure that everything stays very lubricated, because obviously the wheels spin and the bearings spin at quite a speed. So the idea is that we are trying to force grease through every part of the bearing. Now there are very cool little contraptions that you can buy online that forces grease into bearings. I don't have that, but the idea is that you use your hands to get as much of that grease in between the bearings, and then hold the inner race and just turn the bearing just to make sure all the grease is getting in there, and you'll see that it soaks in nicely. And don't be too scared with with this. It might look a bit crazy in terms of the amount, but yeah, it's not a bad thing having too much grease here. And what you'll find when you put this back onto the hub anyway is that a lot of the grease gets sort of forced through with the spindle going through the bearing, so it will even itself out as you put things back together. But that is looking good. I would say it's very messy, so I highly recommend you use gloves on this type of job. Right, let's get all this, just soak it in between as much as possible. Right, and use a little bit of grease to pack in here as well. Like I say, a lot of this will get forced out by the spindle once you got it seated back on the hub. And the good thing is the grease will also hold it in place. So there we go. That is the rear bearing. I'll just get some more of this grease just tucked in there. Always good to use all of it. And there we go. That's the rear bearing now seated. And what we'll do is we'll flip over this disc and yeah, clean up and flip it over and get on to the front part of the hub, and we'll seat this smaller bearing. Okay, so I nearly forgot a major part there, guys, and that is the sealing ring that sits at the back of the disc. This is really important. This is the part that sits between the metal of the disc and obviously the metal of your spindle hub, so very important piece. The disc I'll remove, there's one of these that sits on there, so you don't have to reuse it. It comes as a part of the pack, which is great, and it literally is seated just with a couple of taps. And there we go, and again you'll hear the sound once that's seated. Really important piece because this obviously protects the hub and the disc once it's seated in position. Right, now that that's done, and we nearly forgot a major part, we'll flip it over and we'll start now onto the front part. Obviously this gets a bit crazy because of the amount of grease that's everywhere, so things are very slippery at the moment, so just be careful. And again, like the rear, what you'll see initially, and don't worry about getting grease on the disc itself, we give this a clean before everything goes back together. You'll see there, if the light shows, there's another lip that the race gets pushed down against. And again, you push that right down, make sure it's nice and flush, and then that will seat the bearing nicely. So we'll just use a little bit, very sparingly, just to lubricate the inner surface. Nothing too hectic. Then we'll separate the bearing, leave that to the side ready for packing of grease. This is lubricated, but we'll just, yeah, use the very greasy gloves now. And again, you'll see there's a slight curve outwardly to you. There's a flat surface there on that side of the race. That flat surface has to mate against this lip here. So we'll start off with the soft mallet, just to get it in situ. Just doing gentle taps around. That's slowly going in nicely. So you see it starts to just move down through the hub nice and smoothly there. Right, now that's level with the hub, we can start to use my trusted socket. It's going down nicely. And it looks like we've seated maybe just a couple more taps. There we go. So that, like the rear one, we've got the front now seated, and again you should feel a smooth transition from the race, this part of the metal that we've just pushed in, and into the hub itself. There's a couple of gaps just with the design of the actual inner hub, but there's where the lip is, it should be a smooth transition. There shouldn't be a gap there. And likewise, once you test, bearing sits nicely and flush and square. Now we're ready to start packing the grease on this one. Okay, so just as we did before, we'll take a generous helping of grease and then we'll start to work that through into all parts of the bearing, and we'll try and get it turning. There we go. So you hold it against your finger, you can see the bearings moving around and the grease is working its way into all of the nooks and crannies within the bearing unit. And likewise, again, don't be too scared to use generous amounts here. It's always gooder in the long run. Gooder? I don't even think that's a word. Better. There you go. Better in the long run. Use a little bit more. And make sure we get all the bearing lubricated as best as possible. And likewise, now as we look into the race, we can start to lubricate in here as well. And like I said, don't worry too much if you feel there might be too much in there. It will all come out as the spindle gets seated, or I should say the disc and hub gets seated onto the spindle. So we'll just give that a good layer. Just take these final bits here and get them into the unit itself, and then drop in. There we go. And that should, it's hard, isn't it? It just turn nicely, but it does. And then we can just pack down the sides there. As you saw when I took off the older one, there's quite a lot of grease that sits around the outer sides, which you can just squeeze in, just push in with your finger. And that should be it. We are good to go. That is both bearings front and back now seated and packed with grease. And the good thing is that holds everything in place, which is great. And then when we come to refit the unit itself and the disc itself back onto the spindle, we there's a washer that you saw as I took off. It's a washer that's in a certain shape with a prong directly in the middle, which sits down through the spindle itself. There's only one way it can go on, but that washer, they call it the thrust washer, will seat everything against the hub as you then tighten up the bolt and the nut. So everything there is good to go. That is one disc with wheel bearings packed and ready to get mated back to the car. Okay, so the sun is shining brightly and we are about to reassemble the disc unit onto the spindle hub. And at this point you can be pretty generous with the amount of grease. Don't feel like you're overcompensating or putting too much on, because as you slide the new unit back into place, a lot of this grease will be forced out or down through the spindle, which you'll see when we mount it back on. And we'll get a close-up as well once the unit goes back on, in terms of the thrust washer that is only able to go on in one particular position, so it's pretty simple. You see it there just at the end of the hub, just trying to force itself off there. So just hold that with your thumbs as you push back the unit, and there you go. It's a satisfying clunk that you should feel as it goes back on, with the rubber seal at the back of the unit itself fitting nicely onto the spindle. And there you go, you see the amount of grease that gets forced sort of back out as it slides on. So as we said earlier, So we're just packing the final bit of grease to the end, and there's the thrust washer that will fit in one way and clamps everything together with the nut, which we'll go through in a moment. Okay, so we've now fitted the disc, and I just wanted to show you, this is the thrust washer here, and you can see the little groove in the spindle and the thread. As I pointed out earlier, that washer's got a slot in. It's only one way it will go, so once it's slotted in, that's where it will seat. And then what we do is we then add the nut, and the idea of this is to tighten it to a point where you feel resistance on the disc as you turn. So at the moment there's no resistance, and then you keep turning this until you feel resistance. You keep turning the disc as it seats the bearings squarely, and then we keep turning this. I'll use a spanner in a minute, till we feel resistance twice, and then the idea is once you feel that resistance, you back this nut off 1/2 turn. So if the resistance is felt at this point, you would line this line would go 1/2 turn back, and then you tighten off the nut with the Allen key bolt here, and that is how you set the bearings and the disc for the front. And ideally that will then be seated correctly without any wear happening overdue because of you know, the hub being too tight or the bearings being too tight with the nut. So we'll get that tightened off now. So it's important to keep spinning the disc as we go through the process of tightening up that bolt to its final position, just to make sure that the bearings are seating correctly and that the disc is moving freely without any grinding or strange noises. And we keep tightening now until we get that resistance that I was talking about earlier. Just starting to feel that now as we tighten it down. When we find that resistance after a few turns, we can then back it off that 1/2 turn as suggested in the manual, and the disc, there we go, should run freely. Now of course it might not always be as perfect as that, so it is a little bit of fettling, I guess is the word to use, as you go through this process, just to find where that resistance may lie on your assembly, and then getting it backed off just enough so it spins a bit more freely. And once you find that position, this is where we tighten down that nut with the Allen key bolt through it, the clamping nut, and get it tightened off. And then add the specs as required from the manual in terms of torquing that bolt. Now we're on the home straight in terms of this job and putting things back together. It's a good time to give the disc a decent clean. I usually use virtually all of this tin on both sides, so it's a pretty generous amount that I use, just to make sure the disc is as clean as possible, free from any contaminants or oils. You certainly don't want anything like that on your disc once you've done this job. So of course we're using a lot of grease to get those bearings lubricated, so at every stage try and clean as much as you can all around the disc. So we're going to look at reinstalling now the caliper back into position. You can see it looks pretty neat and tidy now with the backing plate all painted up. I've reinstalled the dust cap on the end of the spindle and disc unit there in the black. A little bit of paint just to tidy it up as well. So all looks good with the calipers in place. One little top tip here as well is the dust cap that I had there, which is the original, I believe, from when the car left the factory. When you buy the bearing packs themselves, they do come with these caps, but generally the caps don't fit. They're not the correct size for whatever reason. So just be aware of that and hold on to your original dust caps if you do have them. Or you might have to go and source some new ones. What I will do with the video description is place all of the torque specs for all the various bolts that require a level of torque. I do this mainly off video because I had a few other bits and pieces to do around the car, so I left the wheels sort of at a normal spec. For the video it looks great and they go on nicely, but I needed to take them off and do a few other bits as said, so I'll get all those specs, torque specs for all the various bolts, put into the description for everyone who's following the video. So we are on the home stretch here. The caliper is in situ and copper grease is your friend on this one, just in terms of fitting the new brake pads. And the TRWs are the ones that I opt for, as I said earlier. And I always find that a light coating of the copper grease around the backing plate of the pad and where the hardware goes through those holes there just saves any sort of future squeaking that you might encompass when you are braking heavily and so on in the future. Always done me well in terms of all my brake systems and cars that I've worked on in the past, so that stuff is worth its weight in gold, or as in copper as they would say. I should mention as well, the cool thing about this copper grease is it tends to be pretty weatherproof, so once you've applied it, even after washing your car or jet washing it right into the wheels and into the brake system to remove all of that build up, if you have been spirited in your driving, this copper grease tends to stick pretty solidly and never really leaves the backing plate of the pad, so it's always present, which is great. As we fit the hardware now to the brake pads, just putting the pins in place ready to slide over the spring assembly. These are two bits of metal that are shaped in a way that causes sort of a spring-like friction just to hold the pads and the unit's in a clamping force, I guess is the best way to describe it. And just make sure that everything is solid and well positioned as you slide those pins back into place and lock everything down. And just take note when you remove these, the position they're in. It should be the small piece, the horizontal piece, that goes in first, with the longer piece that sort of fits in a flat position on top of that, with curves that go up to accommodate the pins as they slide in at top and bottom. It's useful to get your hole punch again, just to ensure that those pins are seated correctly. A few little taps and you can see them just edging towards their final resting place within the caliper unit itself. They just push through there, and that ensures that they are correctly fitted and that the spring mechanism is locked in tightly. So we've fitted the right hand side, driver's side assembly with the new bearings, new discs, new pads, all reinstalled correctly. We speeded up the video just to make it look a bit funny. But what we'll do now is we'll move on to the other side of the car. I'm not going to do any voiceover on that. We're just going to speed it up slightly, just so you can get a full view of beginning to end in terms of the job, going as fast as you can, I guess, even though it's speeded up. So I'm not that fast. And the only thing on the passenger side to be aware of as we go through this is you have the speedo cable that comes through the hub assembly itself. Nothing to worry about. It's just a small clip that holds it in place, which you'll see, and from there you can still go through all the same motions in terms of fitting your new discs, pads and wheel bearings. Enjoy! Okay, so we have the front discs, the front wheel bearings and front pads all installed. I think while you're in there, you get a chance to maybe dig around and check out other parts of the suspension, you know, with those bits removed. So it's always good to have a look at your calipers. I wasn't too worried about my calipers because they're brand new as well, but just making sure that they're doing the job they should be doing with the piston and so on. Just make sure there's no leaks. Likewise, you know, gives you a chance to look at your front strut and your suspension and your lower control arm. Just make sure that bushings and everything's working well. And also I took the time to just spruce up the backing plate. You could get new backing plates, but they're about 50-60 quid, which are quite a lot, I guess. But if yours are holding up quite well, you know, a bit of paint like I've done just gives them a few years extra life. And then, well, while you're in there, just making sure that there's nothing, you know, out of place. So it's always a good time to just check everything over once. So that being said, the top tip for this job, and I think probably the hardest part of this job, is just inserting the front and rear racers within the disc unit itself. And I think that making sure that you've got either a tool that allows you to hammer them in squarely. I was fortunate, I had couple of sockets that are perfect size, so they work really well just to make sure that they seat perfectly within the disc. That's probably the hardest part. From that perspective, then aligning the correct, I guess, torque or pressure when you set the bearings on the spindle hub itself. In the manual, it says, you know, to do it till you get sort of a friction or feel like it's quite hard to turn, and then you back it off 1/2 turn. So there's various methods. I think the best thing is just as you feel it, make sure that all the bearings are set, you know, nicely onto the spindle hub itself, and it should rotate freely without grinding, without any sort of weird noises going on. But once you've got that, you can just tighten it up slightly till you feel that resistance, and just back it off as well. So you'll get a feeling it should feel nice and smooth. And likewise, when you do the test left and right, there shouldn't be any sort of major play. In manuals and forums, they says that there might be a slight little play, which is generally quite normal, but otherwise it should be pretty tight and ready to go. So that overall is the job done. To bed the discs in and bed the pads in, again, there's lots of you know, ideas on how that works. For me, I generally run a slow test, medium, and then fast test. So sort of 10-20 mile an hour, do a couple of stops, 30-40-50 mile an hour, a couple of stops, and then 60-70 hard stops as well. So that then tends to bed in your discs and pads well. If you like this type of content, if you enjoyed watching the videos on the 924, there are going to be some more coming along. So please think about subscribing and follow me on Instagram, and the next videos will be along very soon.